Hi there and welcome back. This is Jennifer McGuire. Today I thought I would revisit an old technique that I really liked. I did a video on this a while back and I will link to it here so you can check it out. But I call this Embossed Impressions, and today I'll do a fun new spin on it. You can do this technique with any dies that you may have, but I find it is most effective and really cool if you use dies with lots of detail. So I'm going to have several examples for you today, and we're going to add some fun, bold watercolor. I'm using a new die set from Pretty Pink Posh called Stitched Foliage. This has 4 leaves and a pumpkin, and it has some faux stitching details, which makes it perfect for this technique. We're going to take these dies and press them into the paper. The paper I chose to use is Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I like that it's bright white, and it's perfect for this technique because it has texture and it'll allow us to add watercolor. Now, if you look closely at these leaves, you'll see that they're impressed into the paper and they have a touch of gold to them. So we're both going to impress and emboss our die cut images. You need to set up your die cut machine as you would if you were using an embossing folder. You can do this with any machine. With the Big Shot, which is what I have, I switched to tab 1, and then I put down one of the cutting plates. To make the impression, you need an embossing pad. This one is from Spellbinders. It's got a little give to it. If you don't have this, you could use a piece of craft foam. Then I'm taking my watercolor paper and putting that onto the embossing pad. I'm using my anti-static powder tool because we're actually going to kind of stamp with our die as we impress. I'm using my anti-static powder tool on my die also because I want to make sure that it's not sticky, it's nice and clean. Now I'm gently, slightly tapping my Versamark ink pad onto the cutting edge of the die. I really just want that ink to be on the cutting edge itself, not on the background. Now I'm going to place this onto my watercolor paper, being sure not to shift. I'm just putting it on the paper and leaving it there. Now I can put a cutting plate on top of that. Run this through my machine, and what will happen is the die will press into the paper to make an impression, and it'll leave that Versamark ink behind in those little crevices that we see. Now I'm adding a fine embossing powder. This is the Hero Arts Gold embossing powder, and that will stick to those fine lines that are impressed into the paper, thanks to that little bit of Versamark ink that we put on the cutting edge of the die. If you find any powder sticks to other areas outside of those lines, you can just brush it away with a dry brush. Now I'm going to let my heat gun get good and hot and bring it to the image. And what you get is a fine gold line that's pressed into the paper. It's gorgeous in real life. Now I did want to show you how this compares to when you just impress the die without the embossing powder. So that example there on the right, I just did the impression with the die in my Big Shot machine with the embossing pad, but didn't add any Versamark ink or gold embossing powder. On the left, I did add the gold embossing powder. 2 different looks, but lots of texture. I like the fine detail that you get with the embossing powder. It gives it a little bit more definition. Now it's time to add color to these images. So I'm using Distress ink to kind of do a watercolor here. You could use absolutely any method you want for this. I just find that since I'm not great with watercolor, Distress inks work really well for me. So what I'm doing is I'm pressing Distress inks onto an acrylic block, basically creating a palette of color. And I'm listing the colors I use up there on the top left corner. The nice thing about Distress inks is you can't go wrong. They all mix together quite nicely. After I've put all the color onto my acrylic block, I'm going to pick the color up using a fine brush and that little bowl of water that you see there. You can use a water brush if you want to. I find those hard to control personally, but many people do like them. Now I'm simply going to add color into our image, staying between those fine lines. The fine lines are pretty easy to stay in between because the embossing powder kind of resists and forces the color to stay in the lines. And also we've impressed these lines into the paper, so that helps with staying inside also. So I'm just mixing the colors, starting with the darkest towards the bottom. Once I put down some color, I come back and I add more water to it, especially on the outside edge, just to help it blend with the next color that we put down. So there you saw me put some more water down. Now I'm coming in with the rusty hinge and adding that. And I'm trying to stay inside of the lines. If you want to save time, you can not worry about that and you'll still get beautiful results, but it's quite easy to do. Now I'm coming in with more water to get that ready to blend with the next color. This is Festive Berries, and I'll follow that with fossilized amber and a little bit of peeled paint on the end. And it really is nice how these all blend together. You could make the colors more intense if you want to by using less water. Now you'll see that those impressed faux stitch lines, the color kind of sits in them, and so it's a little bit darker there. So it really gives a nice definition to these detailed dies like this one. So you can try this with any word die or any die that you may have. But again, I think the results are the best when it has lots of detail, like these particular dies do. You could even color in this leaf with different Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens and then add water and let that do the blending. Really, you can use anything you want for this. There you can see the color blending. I do like to let that sit and dry on its own. I find that I get better results, but if you want to, you can heat set it. So here you can see that little bit of gold detail in the faux stitching and the bold watercolor. Now I wanted to compare that to the one where I did not do the gold embossing, where I just impressed the die into the paper and left it at that. That's the examples you see here. You still get wonderful results, but you don't have that thin gold outline. So it's just two different options for the same technique. Okay, so let's move on to pulling these together into cards. I have a few other techniques to share with you. Let's start with the sentiments that I put on the various cards. I did a few different things. On some of the cards, I used the banner that you see here on the new Pretty Pink Posh Angel Friends stamp set. This has some adorable angel images in it, and I really like that banner. I thought it was a great way to add a sentiment with a different look. And you can stamp any small sentiment onto that banner. Since I wasn't making a Christmas card, I decided to use that little lots of love that you see here in this Pretty Pink Posh Everyday Greetings stamp set, and also the Get Well Soon from this Pretty Pink Posh Rainy Day stamp set that came out quite a while ago. So let's create those banners. I am again using watercolor paper just so that the paper on the banner matches the paper on the background of our card. I try to be consistent like that. So even though I'm not doing watercolor, I'm doing watercolor paper. Stamp the banners with Versamark, and now I'm adding gold embossing powder, and we will heat set that. To get the Lots of Love greeting to stamp on these banners, I need to cut my stamp, and that's okay to do. It's a great way to get more out of your stamp. So I'm cutting the word sending off of this sentiment so that I just have lots of love. Just be sure not to cut the image itself, just the background of it. Now I'm going to mount the Lots of Love at a slight little arch so it matches the arch on the banner. So you can put it on your acrylic block with that little curve to it. And then I can gold heat emboss Lots of Love on the center of two of the banners. And then I will use Get Well on the other two banners from the Rainy Day stamp set that I showed you earlier. I like that you can stamp any small sentiment onto this banner and use it on any card. Okay, so now I went ahead and cut out my little banner right up against the embossed edge. However, you could use the coordinating die if you have that. Now I'm putting thin strips of foam tape on the back so that it pops up nicely. These thin strips are fantastic for adding tiny pieces with dimension to your card. And check out how nice that little banner goes across that leaf. It looks like it was made for it. And by the way, the cards I made today are 4-bar size. They're actually 3.5 by 5, so they're smaller than normal, and I used smaller envelopes, which I'll link to also. Next, I wanted to show you how I made some of the other variations of this card. I used the Pretty Pink Posh Everyday Greetings, which I showed you before. That's where I got lots of love. But I also used the Missing You So Much from this set. And then I used the Pretty Pink Posh Thoughtful Greetings. This one's been around for a while, but that kindness message on the left there, it gets me every time. I really like a lot of the sentiments in this set, and I really like the style. Now at this point, I did not want to mess this card up, so I used my handy Misty to make sure I lined everything up okay. So I used my transparent grid to make sure that sentiment was straight, and then I stamped that with Versamark ink and added gold embossing powder to heat set. Now again, this is a smaller card, so I have trimmed this down and I'm gluing it onto a 3.5 by 5 inch note card. This is a great size when you really want just one image to stay in focus. So there's the example where I did not use the gold embossing powder when I did the impression. Still gives great results. Now for some of these, I decided to do a little gold splatter in the background. I wanted the gold to match my embossing powder. So what I'm doing is flicking some water onto it. And then when that water is still wet, I'm sprinkling on some gold embossing powder. And check it out, that's a great way to do speckles that are heat embossed. You can easily wipe away any of the embossing dots that you don't want, so I can clean up around the sentiment, and you can add more if you want to. That's the joy of using water, because you can rub it away and nobody will ever know. It does take a little longer to heat set that since there's water underneath it, but check it out. You can get great splatter results using embossing powder with water. Now, one more technique that I wanted to show you, and that is to use your dies to make an impression for a matching envelope. So just as we did before, I have my die cut machine set up to do an impression, and I'm putting the die inside of my envelope. Then I'm going to lay it down onto that embossing pad with the cutting edge facing down, run it through my die cut machine, and there we end up with an impression on the front of our envelope. So you can do that on the front of the envelope, on the flap of the envelope, whatever you want. So think about it. Any card that you do with a die on the front, you can use that die to create an impression on an envelope so that it matches perfectly. And this was inspired by my friend Heather over at Handmade by Heather Ruwe. I'll link to her blog here. She is so clever, and she really inspired me to try this, and it really works out great. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the cards I created. Here is one where I made an impression and gold heat embossed from the die. And you can see the bold color that I ended up with when those distress inks dried. And then I have the matching envelope. This time I did the same technique, but I just added it to a green note card. This would be a great technique to make a set of note cards to give to someone as a gift. And think about it, you could do a set of cards with this design and change the sentiment on each of the cards. Really would be fun to do. Here we have a get well soon that's on top of one of the impressed gold embossed leaves. And here you can compare it to the card on the left that I did not use the gold embossing powder. Still beautiful, but you don't have as much of the detail. So for the example without the gold embossing on the leaf, I did do the gold splatter using water and gold embossing powder, and then gold heat embossed a sentiment underneath it. Two different designs, both using the same type of technique. Now you could do the heat embossed impression images with dies and actually use multiple dies at once. You just want to be careful to only put a little Versamark ink on the raised die cut edges. And then once you set them on the paper, don't shift them around or you'll just spread that embossing ink around and get a messy image. So it is possible to do with multiple dies. And then here we have one with that great kindness sentiment that I like so much, and lots of detail thanks to the water and gold heat embossed splatter that I put on top. So there you have a fun technique to try. Be sure to check out my video that I did in the past with a similar technique. Hope this inspires you to give it a try. In the middle are 2 other videos, including the one that I mentioned. Be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. All the supplies are linked below in the YouTube description below and on my blog where I have more photos. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you'll return again soon and see you then.